Pentax-A SMC 50mm f1.7. Whoa, this lens brings me way back because actually this was the very first prime lens I ever got. My first camera was a Pentax K50. It came with the kit lens, and I really wanted a prime lens with shallow depth of field. I was a student back then, actually. I was still getting my PhD at McGill University. So I found the cheapest prime lens I could with a nice wide aperture, which was this 50mm A f1.7. And I bought it used for about $80. Unfortunately, it doesn't work quite right now because the aperture ring gets stuck at f8. So you can still go from f1.7 to f8, but you can't go farther than that. You can't stop down farther. And you can't put the lens in auto aperture. But in theory, the lens has an auto aperture function. So it's a manual focus only lens. And well, that was fine with me because back then I was mostly taking pictures of plants. I didn't really care about autofocus. I still don't care too much about autofocus except when it comes to birds. Anyway, this lens is a cool lens. I was very impressed by the shallow depth of field. I had a lot of fun with this lens. By modern standards, this lens isn't too good. If you look, for example, at the sharpness, here's a comparison chart I made, a quick comparison. At f1.7, f2.8, and f5.6, you have center and mid-frame performance. I'm not putting any corner performance in here because I actually don't have a full-frame camera to try this lens out on. So for the mid-frame performance, I actually use the edge on a Micro Four Thirds sensor. And the reason why I used a Micro Four Thirds camera to test this lens is simply because I don't have any other lenses for my Pentax system anymore. So I decided to use the Micro Four Thirds system with an adapter so I could actually compare it to another lens. And you can see that it is pretty soft at f1.7. It gets a little bit sharper at f2.8, and at f5.6, it's pretty decent. If you compare it, though, to the reference image on the right, which is the Venus Laowa f2.8x macro lens, 50mm from Micro Four Thirds also, you see that it never truly reaches the same sharpness as the Venus Laowa. So it does sharpen up a lot, but it's not as sharp as modern lenses. And a similar story with the mid-frame, although the mid-frame looks kind of about the same as the Laowa when you stop down to f5.6. So it's not the sharpest lens. It's pretty sharp, though. And I think it's sharp enough for most purposes. It looks pretty good to my eye. At least it looked pretty good on the 16 megapixel Pentax K50, which is where I took most of my shots. I actually recently used this lens. I went out to the mountains in the spring, and there were some nice wildflowers there, and I actually attached an extension tube to this lens. And I took some nice extension tube shots, macro, sort of pseudo macro shots, soft, dreamy macro shots of flowers, and I kind of liked it. Bokeh. Like I said, when I first got this lens, it was my first 50mm wide aperture lens, and I really loved the bokeh of this lens. If you look at this bokeh comparison, you can see that the bokeh is not exactly neutral. In terms of rating the neutrality and softness of the bokeh, you can see that the main problems with it, well, first, it has some chromatic aberrations in the out of focus foreground and out of focus background. What's interesting, actually, when you look at this lens is that you can see that it was kind of optimized for the out of focus foreground because the out of focus foreground looks a little softer than the out of focus background. Now, the out of focus background looks okay, but it does have a fairly strong edge to the bokeh circles. Now, sometimes that can kind of produce a cool effect, but it's not exactly a neutral bokeh. So for all these reasons, on my bokeh rating scale, this lens gets a 54.9%. Oh, and I should mention one other thing. Between about f2 and f2.5, the stop-down bokeh looks very strange. It has this Shuriken Ninja style effect. I would avoid those aperture ranges if you're shooting specular highlights. Otherwise, the bokeh looks okay. The main downside to this lens, I think, is that in bright light sources, it does lose a little bit of contrast. It doesn't have a lot of good flaring protection. But I think it's a pretty good lens for $80. It's not so bad. I've taken many shots I've really liked with it. And it was the lens that introduced me to photography. Back then, 2016, 2018, I probably shot, 90% of all my pictures on this lens. It was pretty much the only lens I owned besides the kit lens. And I wasn't the greatest fan of the kit lens. It was not very good either. The Pentax 50mm f1.7A SMC lens is still a pretty decent lens. I had a lot of fun with it back in the day when I was just starting out as a photographer. Back then, I wasn't even shooting birds. I was just shooting random stuff. And I had a lot of fun with this lens. And it could be a good thing to try if you're looking for some older manual focus glass for the Pentax system. So I hope you enjoyed this retro review, and I'll see you again next time.